8. The Liber Noctem. As the Gloamist spoke, Charlie froze, her back pressed against the rear ledge of the bar. He turned his head toward Odette and the two drag performers. "Get out!" With very little power, Glooms could make a puppeted shade pick a penny up off the ground. With more, they could crush your heart by reaching down your throat. Charlie's entire career as a con artist and a thief had been about avoiding facing one directly. The performers rose and scuttled toward the back exit that led to the dumpsters, past the stage. As Odette followed them, she looked back and mouthed something to Charlie. Unfortunately, she had no idea what Odette was trying to tell her. Hopefully, it was that she planned to call the police. Not that Charlie had a high opinion of their bravery in the face of magic, but maybe body cameras might rattle this guy. "Call me Hermes. What do you got on draft?" He had a little South Boston in his voice. She guessed he was in his 30s, with dark hair and pale skin flushed red in the cheeks from wind. He had the look of a practical guy, not someone interested in magic. Not someone with magic. "I guess you didn't hear the owners say we were closed," Charlie told him firmly. At the moment, his shadow was insubstantial as a moonbeam. She knew it cost them something to manipulate it. She just wasn't entirely sure what. "The owner's gone," he said. "Just us now." The etheric shape moved toward her again, so large that the whole room seemed to darken. Charlie crossed her arms over her chest. Hermes slammed his hand down on the bar, making her jump. "Do you know what I could do to you?" Her adrenaline spiked, making it hard to think. But she reminded herself that he had no idea who she was. Whatever had driven him to confront her, he didn't think he was talking to Charlie Hall, thief of magic. He saw only Charlie Hall, over-curious bartender. And that was how she was going to play this, with the arrogance of ignorance. "Do to me? I don't know. What can you do with your scary shadow?" she asked. "Hover a little? Look 2 inches taller if I don't squint? Better sense of smell?" For a moment, she had the satisfaction of Hermes looking flummoxed. Then he snorted. "You really don't know, do you? You know nothing about nothing." "That's me, an ignoramus," Charlie told him, proud of how even her voice sounded. "For instance, I have no idea why you're here harassing me." The man's shade stretched like taffy, toward Charlie and then through a slender seam in the wood of the bar, over the sink and spare glasses and plastic containers of grenadine and simple syrup. And all the time she'd stolen from them, she dreaded the thought of being caught by one of their shadows. To find out the limits of Gloamist powers in the worst way possible. Ironic. To have avoided it then, only to have it happen now. She took a step away, but the narrowness of the bar prevented her from escape. She was trapped with mirrored shelves of booze behind her, along with the register and finicky cappuccino machine. "Paul Echo," Hermes said into that silence. "You might be the last person he spoke with on Earth. Pretty girl like you, I bet he bragged about how rich he was going to be. Maybe showed you a rare object he was intending on selling. But you see, that object belonged to Mr. Salt. Tell us how Echo got it. Tell us, and you can go back to your sad little life and pretend you never had a brush with death." Lionel fucking Salt. This was a fishing operation. Hermes had no idea Charlie knew anything. But she'd lied on the phone to test him, and that had made her look suspicious. In a year away from the work, she'd gotten sloppy. All I did was pour the guy a shot. He has no reason to hurt me, she told herself, although she doubted anyone who worked for Salt would need a reason. The room was quiet, as though she and the man shared a single indrawn breath. "You know what I feed this thing?" the man demanded, stepping away from her and his shadow. "Blood. Maybe yours." Hermes' shade congealed somehow. For a moment it seemed as though he was in two places at once. So convincingly did the shadow recreate him. It appeared solid, although the umbilical cord-like connection to the bearded man's feet remained visible but blurry. A shadow finger reached toward her and Charlie braced. When it brushed her skin, she had the sensation of something cold and a little electric, as though she was being touched by a storm. She stiffened, stumbling back as a wave of fear crested over her, too great and too paralyzing to be her own. Charlie's heart skittered, the unreality of the moment making her dizzy. "Okay, get that thing away from me. You win." Charlie's voice shook as she held up her hands in surrender, backing away. She bit the inside of her cheek to steady herself. "You convinced me. I'll pour you a beer, even though we're closed." The shade didn't move. "You're a real joker, aren't you?" Hermes said. Reaching onto the mirrored shelf, Charlie took down a pint glass. It was slippery in her fingers, her palms sweating. The shade hung in the air, drifting beside her, as she pulled a draft of their nicest IPA. Maybe she could try the truth. Well, some of the truth. "I was walking home and I saw him." Paul Echo. "Dead. I recognized him from Rapture. It looked bad, what happened to him. And then when it wasn't in the news, I guess I got curious." "You're lying," he told her. "You knew him. You called looking for him." "I didn't expect anyone to answer," she said. "And then I thought that if I asked for Paul, the person on the other end of the line would tell me what happened. I didn't expect that you would pretend to be him." "I don't believe it." His anger had the edge of desperation to it, as though going back to his boss empty-handed was something to worry about. "I never met Paul before that night," Charlie insisted, knowing it was futile as she saw Hermes' expression. He didn't want her to be unconnected. She didn't think she could make it to the doors in the back, but she might have to try anyway. She wished for the stupid onyx-handled knife in her purse, wished for anything. "Stop trying to play me," he growled at her. His shadow seemed to be flickering at the edges, as though it was made from some dark fire. "You're in this somehow. The next time you open your mouth, you better be very careful what comes out." He'd already decided what he wanted to hear, and he wasn't willing to listen to anything else. Either she was going to have to make a doomed run for it, or she was going to have to make him believe a good story. Hermes wanted the Liber Noctum for his boss, and believed that he had more than just the pages he wanted to sell, pages that she assumed Echo's murderer had acquired. Charlie could talk about how he'd been asking Balthazar to fence the part he had. But she suspected that he'd already spoken with Balthazar, and that he'd thrown her at least halfway under the bus. After all, Hermes had seemed very certain she was the caller. Charlie pushed the beer across the bar and made a show of sighing. "When Paul came into Rapture, he wasn't alone," she lied. "There was another man. And I heard him say something about a whole book. Does that help?" Hermes hadn't mentioned the book directly, So maybe that would convince him. That could have happened if he really was moving the book for Adam. "Are you sure the thing with him was a man?" Hermes asked. "I think so." She hedged, wondering if there was someone else he was expecting to find involved. Had anyone actually talked to Echo that night? "Edmund Carver," Hermes said. "Was that what Paul called him?" Charlie hesitated. If she said yes, she could tell he'd be pleased. But she had no idea who that person was, and she'd have to supply details that she didn't have. She shook her head again. "I didn't hear a name, and his shadow didn't seem—" His shade struck Charlie in the face, hard enough to knock her off balance. Her hip hit the sink, and her feet went out from under her. She fell to her hands and knees on the tile. "Don't lie to me," Hermes said. Charlie was conscious of many things at once. The stickiness of the floor, the overripe stink of spoiled liquor, the pins and needles feeling of her slapped cheek, her horror of what was happening, the baseball bat that Odette insisted they keep behind the bar, under the ice maker, just out of her reach. Time seemed to slow and speed at once as Charlie crawled to the bat. The bearded man's shade flickered above her, an etheric hand striking the shelf of bottles and sending them down in a rain of shattering glass. Charlie covered her head automatically. A half-full bottle smacked her shoulder as more bottles smashed around her. Little chips of splintered glass flew up from each crash, lodging on her clothes and stinging her skin. Spilled liquor flowed over her knees in a torrent. Charlie's fingers closed around the bat, and she pushed herself to her feet, shaking with adrenaline and fear and rage. With no good ideas, she was going to go for the bad one. They better carve that on her tomb. The Charlie Hall Credo. She swung hard at the shade. The bat passed straight through, as though it were a ghost. The momentum made her stagger forward. She almost fell right on her ass. Hermes cackled. He had stepped back from the bar, as though he were a spectator in what was happening and not its architect. "You're a real firecracker, aren't you? Last chance. The truth this time. Who gave Echo the pages from that book?" The air seemed to thicken around her. "You wouldn't know the truth if it stuck its tongue up your ass," she told him with the best sneer she could summon up. This time, the shade went right down her throat. She felt as though she were drowning, as though her lungs were filled with something heavier than air, something she couldn't cough up. Panicked, she scratched at her throat, choking on shadow, her screams soundless. Wisps of it blew from her mouth and nose, from behind her eyes. Darkness was crowding in the edges of her vision, and she wasn't sure if it was the lack of air or the shadow. For a moment, she felt as though she were standing outside herself, noting the way the edges of her lips were turning blue, watching as she gasped, tipping her chin up as though drowning and seeking the top of the wave. When Charlie opened her eyes, she found herself on the tiles. She could breathe again, although inhaling hurt. Charlie looked up at the mirrored ball on the ceiling and saw a figure standing behind Hermes, arm pressed to his throat. But from their blurred shape, she couldn't identify the new person. Their arrival must have been what made Hermes call his shadow back. She began crawling slowly over the glass-covered floor, telling herself that when she made it to the open area of the lounge, she was going to run for the back doors, hit them hard with her shoulder, and not look back. "You've let your shadow feed for too long tonight." Impossibly, it was Vince's voice she heard. But it had gone all wrong. Soft, and menacing, as oblivious to Hermes' squirming as if it were irrelevant. There's not much of you left. Can you feel the strain? Like something spooling out of you. The man made a choking sound, twisting his body, trying desperately to break free. It doesn't matter now. Charlie almost couldn't recognize this Vince, standing in the middle of the empty club, tightening his grip. Then came a sound like a wet branch breaking. She caught her breath. Reflected in a dozen tiny mirrors, the bearded man hung limply in Vince's arms. 9. The past. Charlie took to pickpocketing like it was what her fingers were made to do. At 12, Rand set her up to study with a retired magician who had learned to lift wallets and watches as part of her act. And every Tuesday and Thursday after school, he would drop her off at Miss Presto's house. He told Charlie's mom that it was for piano lessons. Miss Presto smoked, and her whole house reeked of it. It was a small place, over in Leeds, with barely any backyard. Inside, it was stuffed with antique memorabilia, including an automaton that had once graced a department store but now stood in a corner wearing a top hat, with half its face missing. The only magicians people have heard of are men, but some of the greats were women, Miss Presto would say, waving her cigarette around. And let me tell you something. The best grifters were always the females. We know how people think. We've got the nerve, and we don't get caught. Charlie liked the way Miss Presto included her in that declaration. We. And she especially liked the idea that she might dodge any consequences. So the first thing you have to understand is the tap. You tap somewhere on the body of the mock while you make the lift. Maybe you bump into them if you're walking, or touch their shoulder if they're sitting in a crowded restaurant. People think the tap is misdirection, but that's not it. The brain can't process the feeling of being touched in two places at once, so it only alerts the mind to the harder hit. Tap them on the shoulder and they don't feel your hand in their pocket or purse. There's no real finesse, just grab. Charlie thought about that. Miss Presto gave her a cardamom hard candy out of a silver skull on her coffee table. What if you stick your hand in a purse and there's too much stuff? Or what if it's zippered? Ah, now that's where misdirection comes in, she said. Surprise them, razzle-dazzle them, or just pick an easier mark. Lots of fish in the sea, and some of them are wearing solid gold chains. What about clasps? When Miss Presto had first started talking, it had seemed simple. But the more Charlie thought about it, the harder it seemed. It took her 3 tries to put a necklace on, much less take one off of someone with one hand, all while razzle-dazzling them. Hand on the back of the neck, a little pressure, and clever fingers, said Miss Presto. It's all the same. Let's start practicing. First, they hung jackets on the automaton and strapped watches onto the arms of chairs. Then, when Charlie had mastered that, Miss Presto would walk around her house so that Charlie could pretend to bump into her or be walking up to her in a crowd. Finally, they were ready to go out. One afternoon, Rand drove her to the Holyoke Mall instead of Miss Presto's house. "We going shopping?" Charlie asked. Rand didn't even seem to mind her tone. He grinned like the joke was on her. "Your lesson is here today." Miss Presto met her in Macy's, where she was buying a pair of sneakers. "Never hurts to have a bag on you," she told Charlie. Then she smiled. "Or an old woman with you." They walked out into the main mall. "Am I going to watch you first?" Charlie asked hopefully. Miss Presto shook her head. "No point delaying the inevitable. Let's go toward the Starbucks. There's always a crowd there." And so Charlie started the first day of on-the-job training. She slid past people in narrow aisles with an "excuse me" and a touch on the arm. It worked in Sephora and the Apple Store. Easier than she would have thought, too, but not particularly precise. She did manage to lift a wallet from a guy, but all the forays into handbags resulted in her getting random things. A key ring, a lipstick, and once, a balled-up tissue. After 5 lifts, Miss Presto bought her a Frappuccino. "2 things," she said. "Once you got the thing, you put it in your pocket. What did you do after that?" Charlie shrugged. "Walked away?" "In the future," Miss Presto said, eyeing her seriously. "You're going to take out a candy or some money. Whatever it is you want people to think you put your hand into your pocket for. Always keep something in there to pull out. Always. Otherwise, you're giving them 2 things to notice: the lift itself and the hand coming out of the pocket empty." Even though no one had said anything to Charlie, her palms started to sweat at the thought that she'd made such an obvious mistake. "Oh, and you don't strike me as much of a hugger," Miss Presto said. Charlie shrugged again. No one in her family was a hugger, except her grandmother, who she didn't get to see much. Not even she and Posey hugged. "Get used to touching people while you talk. Hand on their arm, hand on their shoulder, embrace them when you see them, and again when you leave. That way, when you have to do it, you know how to make it seem natural." "Okay," Charlie agreed, and took a long sip of her Frappuccino. This was the one piece of advice, no matter how wise, she knew she was not going to follow. 10. Full Tilt Boogie. Looking at the dead man on the floor of Rapture, Charlie knew she had to do something. But the shock of violence rooted her in place. Vince, her Vince, so even-keeled that he didn't react even when he got shoved, had murdered someone. And he didn't realize she'd seen him. If she sank back down to the floor, lying in the wet and the glass, she could pretend she'd been unconscious the whole time. Only when he touched her would she blink up at him like Snow White, the chunk of apple dislodged from her throat. Then he could make up any lie he liked about what had happened, and she could nod along. "Oh, that dead guy? He must have slipped on a banana peel." Charlie pulled herself to her feet instead, holding on to the bar top. Made herself appear surprised he was there. "Vince? How did you get—" The light turned his features hard-edged, and she remembered how she'd found him frightening that first night in the bar, before he'd spoken. He watched her gaze go from him to the dead man, take in the way Hermes' neck was at the wrong angle. Vince's face seemed horribly washed of expression. Keep looking surprised, she told herself. Everything is very surprising. He's gone, Vince said, crossing the floor to her. You're bleeding. Funny that he could kill Hermes, but wasn't going to call him dead. Went for the polite euphemism. Gone. Very, very far gone. I'm fine, Charlie insisted, although she wasn't at all sure. Her body hurt from being struck with bottles. She could feel the sharp sting of shallow cuts, and there was very probably glass in her bra. Her thoughts were absurd. Also, there was a corpse in the middle of the floor. A corpse whose shadow was still moving, squirming and pulling against the connection to the bearded man as if it wanted to be free. Charlie shuddered, a visceral horror moving through her. What is that? It'll settle after a couple of minutes, he said, after a pause where they both stared at the struggling shadow. Is it a blight? Charlie didn't understand the details of how energy exchange worked for Gloamists, but she understood enough to know that the more of themselves they put into their shadow, the more it could do. A Gloamist could let their shadow draw their energy directly, but they could also put pieces of themselves, memories they no longer wanted, desires that shamed them, emotions that stood in their way, into their shadow. Upon a Gloamist's death, that could become a blight. Detached shadows cut off not just from a human, but from their own humanity. Most were little better than animals, and the Gloamists made it their business to hunt them down. Others could think and reason. Charlie had seen very few, and never expected to witness the birth of one. Vince didn't meet her gaze. It might be. Charlie thought of Paul Echo's shadow, of the way that it had been shredded, as though his shadow had been destroyed separately from whatever killed him. And she considered Vince, who seemed to know a lot more about gloaming than she'd thought. Is it dying? She asked, hush-voiced. He nodded. Unless it's cut free or it tears free, it'll die. She remembered breathing the shadow into her lungs, remembered the blow from its hand. It might be pitiful to watch the thing struggle, but she was glad it couldn't get to her, and glad it would soon be gone. Vince shook his head. Is anyone here but you? Charlie glanced toward the back room. Odette and the others had gone in the direction of the exit behind the stage, but it was possible that one or more of them had locked themselves in her office instead of leaving. Maybe. He nodded. I've got to move the body into my van. You going to be okay by yourself? I said I was fine. Charlie put both hands on the bar top. She felt a little lightheaded, but that was all. He nodded, like he didn't believe her, but didn't have time to argue either. Charlie went out from behind the bar, slowly and carefully stepping around the glass. Chunks of it were already embedded in the bottoms of her Crocs. It gave them an uneven fall on the floor and caused them to make a harsh sound, like tap shoes. Glass slippers. Gingerly, she navigated her way over to a table. There was still a tea candle burning on it, the wax gone liquid and the glass burned dark. That was when the blight ripped free and came at Charlie directly. Onyx was useful in two ways for stopping quickened shadows. It weakened them and forced them to become solid, so that a knife with onyx in it could cut them no matter how translucent they appeared. But Charlie didn't have any onyx, and what hurt shadows the most was the brightest light. Fire. Charlie grabbed the candle, not caring how the hot wax splashed her wrist or the glass scorched her fingers. She swept it down toward the blight, tossing the flame right at it. The shadow caught and flared bright as dry brush. For a moment, she just stared at the broken tea light, the spill of wax, her burnt fingers. And Vince stared at her. "Quick thinking," he said. Charlie sat heavily in a nearby chair, nodded. Vince heaved up the body over his shoulder, like it was a dead deer or something. He headed for the double doors of Rapture. "Was he the first person you've killed?" The words sat on Charlie's tongue. She swallowed them. His job was cleaning up crime scenes. She'd like to believe that gave him some perspective when it came to handling the dead, a reason to be so calm. But murdering someone, that was a whole other thing. Her ex-boyfriend's brother, the one who eventually shot her, had been in prison for knocking over a liquor store. He'd told her about how after their first kill, people's minds don't work right. They go full tilt boogie, bubble-brained. That's why, even if they're normally meticulous, even if they planned the whole thing, they start screwing up. They do stuff that doesn't make sense, like calmly letting in the police when their whole bedroom is covered in blood, or renting a getaway car under their own name. Vince wasn't acting like that. He'd done this before. And a history with murder wasn't the only secret he'd been keeping, given the way he'd spoken about that Gloamist's shadow. He knew much more about that world than he'd ever let on. As much as she'd been keeping from him, he'd been keeping a lot more from her. She looked down at the stupid bike shorts she was wearing, at her stretchy dress soaked with spilled booze. Beads of blood were blooming along her calves where shards of glass struck her. And when she looked at the backs of her hands, she was surprised to find they were bleeding too. It was hard to fault Vince, though. Whatever his secrets were, she could still count on him. He was currently getting rid of a dead body for her. You couldn't get more dependable than that. A little laugh escaped her mouth. A weird giggle. Her gaze fell on the floorboards and her own shadow. She blinked at it twice, waiting for her vision to clear. It seemed to ripple. Had Hermes done something to it? Puzzled, she leaned down and touched her hand to its shadow on the floor. It met her, as usual. When she pulled back, she left a small smear of blood from the cuts on her fingers behind. Just then the landline behind the bar began to ring, making her jump. Charlie staggered back to the bar. "Yes?" "Darling," said Odette, sounding for all the world like a starlet from the past. "I heard a terrible crash and then everything went quiet." "Are you still in your office?" Charlie asked, ashamed of the way her voice didn't come out as evenly as she'd intended. "He's gone, but he left a real mess. You shouldn't have stayed." The line disconnected. A moment later, she heard the turning of tumblers. Odette sauntered back into the room just as Vince came through the double doors. "Did the police finally come? I called them ages ago." She regarded them in the room, taking in the destruction of her club and the presence of Vincent with a somewhat stunned expression. "No one here but us." Charlie realized abruptly that she wasn't okay after all. Her hands were shaking. She thought she might have to sit down. She thought she might not make it to a chair before she did. Odette was talking. "Did you know that man? I tried to get the gun out of the safe in the back, but I couldn't remember the combination. Charlie knelt down on the floor, forcing herself to take a few deep, even breaths. That was what she did when she was having a panic attack. And she suspected this was going to be a monster of a panic attack. What? That man, Odette frowned at her. He seemed to think he knew you. And perhaps you should move off the floor. A chair would probably be more comfortable. Cleaner, I'm sure. He thought I knew someone else, but I don't. I didn't. Maybe Charlie was the one whose mind had gone full tilt boogie. I'm good right here. Odette sat down on a bar stool. She looked at the smashed wall of liquor and gave a long sigh. I don't understand the world anymore. I think I'm getting old. Charlie shook her head. Never. Did you see what that man did? With his... Odette looked toward the double doors, the way she'd been looking when the magic rolled toward her. With Balthazar's shadow parlor, I saw the wondrous part of gloaming, but not the awful side. Yeah, Charlie said quietly. It was horrible. Odette glanced toward Vince, then back at Charlie. Do you think this has something to do with Balthazar? The man was looking for a guy they tossed out the other night, she said after a moment. But why ask you? Odette said, which was an entirely reasonable point. Charlie opened her mouth, trying to find some explanation that could make sense, when Vince interrupted her. Is there a first aid kit somewhere? She's bleeding. Oh, of course. In my office, Odette said, rising from her bar stool. Just tell me where, Charlie began, but Odette cut her off. Don't be ridiculous. Stay. She headed into the back again. Charlie sighed and deliberately did not look at her shadow, which might or might not be moving, which might or might not mean something. I'm fine. I know. Vince squatted down next to her and ran his hands lightly over her arms, checking for cuts. His fingers were careful, like how he kissed. Not the rough, blunt pressure against a jaw. Vince, she said. He took her hand and smiled like any kindly boyfriend, one who didn't believe he'd been overheard talking about magic, who hoped she didn't know or wouldn't mind too much about him being a murderer. Odette returned with the kit, cell phone tucked against her cheek. You know that if I had called you from a goddamn Fridays, you would have sent someone immediately. She dumped a lumpy red bag with the caduceus symbol unceremoniously beside Vince. You think my tax money's no good because there's a whip painted on my sign? Vince searched through, took out a length of gauze, and then wetted it with soap and water from the bar sink. There are a few pieces of glass I want to get out. You better go, she whispered to him. Now. He had a body in his van. It seemed impossible that the police would overlook that piece of evidence. Just a second. He wiped off some blood. He discovered what Charlie thought were probably eyebrow tweezers in the kit. Charlie wondered if there was emergency eyeliner in there too. Knowing Odette? Very possibly. The glass came out easily. At the sight of the shard, the gleaming blue of a Bombay sapphire gin bottle, Charlie felt a bit dizzy. Part of her wished she'd taken a shot of something before he started. But the last thing she needed right then was to be slow-witted. If the police aren't here in 10 minutes, I am going to wake up the mayor. Odette purred into the phone. Mark my words. Charlie had no idea if Odette knew the mayor or not. It wasn't impossible. I'll see you at home, Vince said. He didn't stop bandaging her leg, his hands steady and sure, as though he'd done this before too, not just the murdering. Charlie took a breath, let it out. The whole night had felt like one long tumble down a well, and she might still be falling. Yeah, go, you have to go. Vince rose, put his hand on her shoulder, and then headed for the door in the back. Where's your fella off to? Odette asked. She was behind the bar, rummaging in the drawers, pulling out extra napkins and themed drink stirrers. He wants to avoid the local constabulary. Charlie pushed herself up. What are you hunting for? Odette raised her tattooed eyebrows, but when it was clear that Charlie wasn't going to say anything more about Vince, she relented. An ancient pack of clove cigarettes. I know I put some in here, maybe 5 years ago, 10. I need something. My hands are shaking. Maybe I should take a gummy. Maybe, Charlie agreed. Would you like one? Odette asked. She was tempted but shook her head. She hadn't taken a shot, so there seemed like no point in anything less immediately effective. Odette got a plastic bottle out of her handbag, opened it, and popped a handful of THC gummies into her mouth. In about a half hour, she was going to be either unconscious or tripping balls. You okay not mentioning Vince? Charlie asked her. I could be, Odette said. But I'd like it if you told me what kind of trouble he's avoiding. I don't know, Charlie said, inventing a whole backstory as she spoke. He said it was from when he was a kid. We've all got stuff. What's in the past doesn't matter now. Oh, honey. Odette put her hand on Charlie's arm, giving her a fond squeeze. The past is the only thing that matters. The police arrived 15 minutes later, sirens going as though they'd been in a rush the whole time, rather than moseying up 55 minutes after being called. Odette let them in. A detective named Juarez took down Charlie's statement that a man had pushed his way in and trashed the place. He saved his eye roll for when Odette explained there were no cameras because she believed in the privacy of her patrons. No one said anything about shadows or magic. Detective Juarez told them he'd write up a report and that a photographer and someone from forensics would come over tomorrow to document the damage. Then he gave Odette his card and said he'd be in touch. Personally, Charlie doubted Odette would ever hear from him again.